Across the past century, millions of people have organized, marched, and sacrificed to demand a seat at the table of human dignity. This forest of demand signs represents a peak in the pursuit of freedom, a moment when mid-century anti-colonial and civil rights movements mobilized entire populations. Despite these massive mobilizations and the localized victories that followed, the global systems of structural inequality and dispossession have largely survived the transition. It raises a difficult question. Why have these world-altering efforts failed to deliver a true, lasting liberation for the human family? The issue isn't a lack of courage. It's that our collective vision of the struggle has been shattered into fragmented views. We have to look at divide and rule as more than a simple tactic. It is the foundational architecture used to manage the oppressed. In the colonial Americas, enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and poor European settlers occupied the same bottom rung of the social order. They shared overlapping interests against the same colonial exploitation. Colonial administrators recognized this threat and responded by compartmentalizing each group's struggle, preventing them from seeing their common condition and pitting their self-interests against one another. Centuries later in Africa, we saw this pattern repeat. Nationalist movements achieved independence, yet these localized victories often clashed with broader Pan-African visions of continental unity. This historical fragmentation is a design feature. It ensures that no single force ever consolidates enough strength to topple the overarching structures of control. This brings us to the most pervasive framework of division inherited today, the race-based struggle. This framework was forced into existence. Colonial systems weaponized skin color, using eugenics and pseudoscience to build the brutal hierarchies we see in these signs. In a logical response to that systemic brutality, resistance movements organized along these exact same color lines to defend their communities. But viewing the conflict through race alone limits our perception. It focuses our attention on surface appearances, rather than the intricate dynamics of power beneath them. When we define liberation strictly within these racial parameters, we unwittingly internalize the boundaries drawn by the original system. Adopting the oppressor's racial categories as our primary map risks seeking parity within their system rather than its total dismantling. This creates a containment effect, where resistance stays within the lines drawn for it, leaving the foundational machinery of control invisible and unchallenged. This containment doesn't just happen with race. It applies to nearly all the ideological isms we are taught to fight within. We are encouraged to channel our energy into fragmented frameworks: Marxism, feminism, nationalism, and tribalism. These movements often address real suffering, but they inherently prioritize narrow, localized agendas. This keeps us fighting for a piece of the existing system, rather than questioning its existence. The mechanism at work here is psychological. Oppressive systems exploit our innate drive for group identity and our instinct for self-preservation. By funneling our righteous anger into endless competing factions, the system ensures we exhaust ourselves fighting different heads of the same beast. This proliferation of competing isms is not an accident of history. It is the system functioning exactly as it was designed to. To break the cycle, we have to recognize that the longing for freedom transcends class, gender, and nation. This hierarchy identifies true oppression as an ideological force, a deceptive worldview that sustains itself through human separation. From this perspective, racism, classism, and tribalism are the deliberately constructed layers designed to insulate the apex of power. Real liberation requires a refusal to play within these predefined boundaries. We cannot dismantle the system using the very logic that built it. True freedom begins when we look past the fragmentation, recognize our shared struggle, and unite against the engine of division itself. Liberation movements ended colonial administrations and overturned segregation laws, yet many found themselves locked within a reality defined by their oppressors. For generations, the boundaries of this conflict have been set by the color line, the internalized belief that the global struggle for freedom is a binary war between black and white. This framework was cemented by scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, who declared that the central problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. If the color line dictates the rules of engagement, we have to ask a deeper question. Who actually drew that line, and what tools did they use to build it? The global racial hierarchy functions as a deliberately engineered intellectual and pseudo-scientific construct, a tool manufactured to divide humanity and consolidate power. We can trace the exact construction of this architecture. It begins with philosophical justification, hardens into pseudo-scientific validation, and is finally executed as institutionalized colonial policy. To fight across this color line is to wage war inside the architect's blueprint. It guarantees a resistance that is tethered to the very logic it hopes to destroy. By the late 18th century, European expansion sought an ideological anchor for its expansion, moving past territorial conquest to find a structured, pervasive worldview. The intellectual scaffolding for this worldview was provided by the Enlightenment. Thinkers revered for advancing reason actively engineered the moral justifications used to legitimize human exploitation. In 1748, philosopher David Hume laid the first major blocks of this foundation. He explicitly wrote that he suspected Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites, formalizing prejudice into intellectual discourse. 16 years later, Immanuel Kant poured the reinforcing mortar. Kant asserted that the people of Africa possessed no feeling that rises above the trifling. These thinkers established the academic legitimacy of a fabricated hierarchy. Their pronouncements provided the moral bedrock for global domination. By the late 19th century, the field of biology was co-opted to disguise this philosophical prejudice as empirical truth. In 1883, Francis Galton spearheaded a new movement he called eugenics. The mechanism of eugenics was the improvement of human populations by promoting the reproduction of the fit and eliminating the unfit. Fitness was measured through a fabricated, racialized metric, one that placed Europeans at the absolute apex of human development. This theory rapidly mutated into state policy. Across Western nations, eugenics drove forced sterilizations and severe immigration restrictions. Philosophy had been hardened into a biological standard. Racism was upgraded from a theoretical idea into an actionable weapon of statecraft. On the African continent, these intellectual frameworks physically manifested. They became the structural fabric of daily colonial rule. South Africa's apartheid system was explicitly constructed on eugenicist principles. The Population Registration Acts of 1949 and 1950 used these biological classifications to dictate access to land and power. In Kenya, the dispossession of ancestral territories to create the White Highlands was justified by claims of African backwardness. In Rhodesia, discrimination in voting rights and land ownership enshrined white settlers as the designated stewards of civilization. Control extended far beyond property lines. It targeted the mind through the colonial educational system. Curricula were designed to colonize the mind, presenting Western science as universal truth while reducing indigenous African knowledge systems to folklore. The intellectual architecture drafted by Hume, Kant, and Galton was now an operational physical cage. It dominated the resources, daily lives, and self-perception of millions. The response was born out of necessity. African liberation struggles mobilized to tear down these structures of racial domination. Pan-Africanism rose as a reactive counterforce to global white supremacy. Leaders like Marcus Garvey rallied millions around messages of Black pride and economic self-sufficiency to resist the machinery of the color line. Kwame Nkrumah argued that the anti-colonial struggle required dismantling the specific racial domination imposed by European empires. In South Africa, organizations like the ANC and PAC were forced to organize in racial terms to combat the brutality of apartheid. Thinkers like Frantz Fanon analyzed how colonialism had entrenched white supremacy deep into the psyche of the colonized. And Steve Biko's Black consciousness movement emphasized the psychological necessity of shedding internalized inferiority. These leaders pushed back, but their lines of resistance mirrored the exact shape of the oppressor's ideological cage. By organizing around race, they were forced to play by the rules of the system rather than rewriting them. Over the 20th century, colonial governments fell and overt racial laws were dismantled. Yet beneath the rubble of those shattered institutions, the underlying philosophical and ideological parameters remained etched into the social subconscious. The Pan-African and Black consciousness movements were historically necessary. They laid the groundwork for human dignity and physical survival. This mode of resistance carried an inherent limitation. By centering the fight on Enlightenment philosophy and eugenics, it adopted the oppressor's premise that race was the defining metric of human reality. When the struggle is defined by the same categories that built the cage, the resulting freedom is confined to the same parameters. This reactive liberation addresses the conditions of the cell without questioning why the bars were placed there in the first place. Treating the symptoms of white supremacy along the color line is no longer enough. True liberation demands recognizing the blueprint for what it is and intellectually stepping outside the architecture of domination.